President Biden has proposed a peace plan which would cease hostilities between Hamas and Israel going on currently in the Gaza Strip. This peace plan has had a variety of very interesting responses from all parties involved and even some parties which are not involved. And today we're going to discuss what exactly the plan entails and whether or not it has any chance of succeeding. Spoiler alert, I do not think that it does. But why exactly do I not think it will succeed? Well, you're going to have to find out tonight on this episode of The Watchdog. Shalom, friends, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of The Watchdog. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are indeed living in biblical times. And for those of you who are here, I'd just like to say, first off, shaloms to all of y'all. Thank you very much for being here. If you are here, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so, and hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. Remember, you can leave any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, or anything of that nature in the comment section down below. And, of course, you can follow me on various social media platforms. I am on Gab, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Minds, MeWe, Telegram, and I'm pretty sure, and Truth Social. So if you are on any of those websites, please do consider giving your boy a holler, following the channel, and, of course, sharing this video to those channels. It is greatly appreciated when you do these things. Also, excuse me, also would like to remind you guys to follow us over on the Rumble channel, again, at the Tag the Synagogue. Rumble is important to follow. It's important to follow us on the Rumble channel for a couple of reasons. Number one, sometimes our videos are taken down, and if those videos are taken down, they are uploaded on the Rumble channel. Although recently I figured out that my last 7 months has, I think, been privatized. I'm not really sure what happened to it, but nevertheless, I'm going to get those back up here in just a second. Once we get that fixed, you'll be finding all that content here. And of course, this video is not going to be impacted by whatever happened there at all. But nevertheless, it is important to follow us on there in case we do have any of these videos taken down. The second reason why it's important for you to follow us over on Rumble is because it's always possible that this entire channel could get taken down. YouTube is not a very big fan of conservative political content, and so it is always a possibility that we say something that offends the overlords in regards to abortion, or in regards to illegal immigration, in regards to nationalism, in regards to whether or not we should have free health care, student debt, global warming, the jab, you know what I mean, so on and so forth, so many different things, transgenderism, homosexual mirage, all this other kind of stuff. There's so many different things we could say that might possibly offend the overlords. So not only can you get our videos that are taken down, but if the channel is taken down, you can always follow us on the Rumble account, and that's where you would get the show, period, right? So that certainly is very important as well. The third reason why you should be subscribing to us on the Rumble is just simply because it's on Rumble. Rumble is right now the largest video sharing platform not named YouTube, which is rather important if we want to fight back against those who would like to take our free speech away on the internet, right? The governments of the world are not going to help you win back internet free speech. The companies that are taking it away are certainly not going to help because they're the ones taking it away to begin with. So what recourse do you have? If you don't have the courts and you don't have the companies, what recourse do you have? Well, you have the competition, right? Can't use courts, can't use companies, can use competition, right? It's still a capitalist economy. YouTube still wants your view. It still wants that ad revenue. It still wants your dollar, quote unquote. I put quotes around that only because it gets your dollar in a kind of roundabout way, but it still gets it, right? And it wants it. It needs it. It feeds off of it. So you going to the Rumble and watching videos on Rumble does one of two things. It, number one, incentivizes YouTube to stop policing conservative content, historical content, philosophical content, religious content, or any other content they don't like. And number two, it grows the power and quality of Rumble, because it's always possible that YouTube won't give in to our demands, and so we're gonna need somewhere else to go. Where do we go? We go to Rumble. And of course, right now, Rumble is dominated only by those categories: history, philosophy, religion, conservative politics, that are being censored on YouTube. But eventually, all people on YouTube will be wanting to leave YouTube and go somewhere where they're actually able to freely discuss their ideas. And Rumble right now looks like it's going to be the very best option for that. So definitely do consider subscribing to our channel on the Rumble for all of those various reasons. Certainly appreciate anybody who is doing that. By the way, links to all of our social media and the Rumble are down below. Links are also down below to any of the payment methods that you can use, right? So if anybody here is interested in contributing to the work that we do, if you like our journalism here and would like us to continue to do it, you can actually contribute to the work we do here either by subscribing to the Patreon for a monthly fee. You can give as much or as little as you like, but if you give $10 monthly, you will get access to our Blogladite blog, which is going back up this Saturday, actually. So if you guys are interested in reading the article we put up here this Saturday, it's going to be bi-weekly. We might end up cutting the price there to $5 because I feel like maybe 10 is a little bit too much, because that'd be about $5 an article, right? If it's bi-weekly and it's $10 per month, well, give or take, that means you're going to usually get about 2 articles per month. So we might end up shooting that back down to $5. I'm not quite sure yet. But nevertheless, you can give as much or as little as you like. You don't have to join that tier. And if you do join that tier, you can get access to the Blogladite blog and get some of my thoughts on things that are not necessarily current events, but more in the political philosophy realm. You can also give a one-time donation through the PayPal if you're not interested in donating monthly at all. If you say, hey, I want to contribute to the work you're doing here on the Watchdog, but I really don't feel confident in my ability or desire to give every single month, well, that's perfectly fine. We have a PayPal link down there as well. Link is in the description below. You can give as much or as little as you like, and I certainly appreciate anybody who is giving, contributing to the work that we're doing here, which of course I wouldn't be doing if I didn't think was very important. The only way we're going to fight against big news, similarly to the way we fight against big tech censorship, is by using the competition. And there's multiple ways you can use me as a form of conservative competition. That is with views, likes, shares, subscribes, and with dollars. So anybody who contributes in any of those ways, I greatly appreciate your contribution there. That's pretty much all we have for the channel housekeeping besides our This Days in History. And instead of doing a This Day in History, what I'd like to do today is wish all of you guys a Chag Sameach. It is the first day of Shavuot. So for those of you who celebrate Jewish holidays, whether you be Hebrew roots Christians or Christians who otherwise celebrate the biblical holidays, or if you be Jews, whether that be Messianic, Orthodox, secular, whatever it happens to be, today is, of course, the first day of Shavuot. And actually, it's now nightfall, which means it is officially the first day of Shavuot. Remember, Jewish days begin at nightfall and not at midnight like our I guess Western days is what you would call that. I don't know exactly what you call it. It's not just an American day, right? Other countries do it as well. Anyways, not the point. The point is this is the first of the 2 Jewish harvest festivals, the Spring Harvest Festival. It's the one that is commonly associated with the Book of Ruth because the Book of Ruth takes place during the Shavuot season. It is the one that the Greek-speaking Jews called Pentecostis, or Pentecost as we call it today. And therefore, it is the day that the Holy Spirit descended from on high upon those in the upper room. So very important holiday, whether you're a Christian or a Jew. And I would like to wish everybody a Chag Shavuot Sameach. And may everything that you do on this holiday be blessed. All right. That's pretty much all we have for channel housekeeping today, friends. We have a whole interesting show here for you today. Want to, of course, keep these around an hour, so we want to just jump right into the topic at hand, which is that President Joe Biden, or more accurately, President Joe Biden's handlers, have proposed through President Joe Biden a peace plan for the Middle East. As some of you may know, should be every single one of you, but unfortunately, some people do live under rocks. I'm kidding, of course. Israel has been at war for 8 months now, starting on October the 7th, 2023. That is Simchat Torah. The terrorist organization known as Hamas attacked and brutally massacred 1,200 Israelis in a single day. It's the largest terrorist attack on Israel in its history. It's also the largest execution of Jews in one day since the Holocaust. It was a pretty massive event. You may have heard of it. And it ended up sparking what thus far has been the deadliest war in Israel's history, at least in terms of total casualties and total deaths. Not yet in terms of Israeli deaths. The war for independence in 1948 takes the cake for that one. The longest war in Israel's history is just over a year. It's also that Israeli war for independence, although it does depend on what exactly you classify as a war. You could consider like the War of Attrition, which was 3 years, a war. But that's not a declared war. It's more like what we did in Vietnam as a police action. As far as declared wars, this is very quickly approaching the longest war in Israel's history. And with 35,000 Palestinians dead and 1,500 Israelis dead, it has had the most individual deaths of any conflict the modern state of Israel has ever been involved with. It's also probably Israel's most aggressive war, as this is the first time they have decided to kind of just go balls to the wall and say, hey, we're not actually messing around with y'all anymore. You attacked us. You slaughtered a bunch of our innocent civilians. Typically, we end up just doing enough to win the conflict and then backing off. Now, no more. We're going to completely and totally annihilate the Hamas organization, and that has been their goal thus far. And it has led to much destruction in Gaza, including destruction of the two most populous cities in Gaza, Gaza City and Rafah. We're not here to talk about the ethics of that. Many of you know I do support Israel in this particular endeavor, but I digress. These are the facts. And regardless of if the good guys win, it is certainly never a good thing to see this much death and destruction. And with all that being said, Joe Biden, or more accurately, the handlers of Joe Biden, have proposed a peace plan for the Middle East, something to end the hostilities there as pressure continuously mounts from foreign nations upon Israel to end the invasion and so far occupation, although it's only been a couple of months, of the Gaza Strip for the reason of civilian death, right? They don't want the civilians to be suffering anymore, and indeed they are suffering. That certainly is a fact. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go over the peace plan, and we're going to go over some of the consequences of this peace plan, namely who has said what about it, obviously starting with Israel and Hamas, but also moving towards other nations, some international organizations, and if we have the time, some other American politicians as well. Well, let's go ahead and pull up the, let's see here. Go ahead and pull up the tab here. Biden has proposed a peace plan. Let's go ahead and read the first article that we have today. This is going to be from Certainly Not News, otherwise known as CNN. Unfortunately, they have the best article I could find on this, which is kind of saying something about a lot of the other news organizations that I follow. You guys need to step it up, man. CNN should never be the best at anything. They're terrible. But at any rate, I guess they're letting me use this for free, so maybe I should thank them a little. And the article is titled, Biden says it's time for this war to end as he lays out Israeli ceasefire proposal. This was originally published on May the 31st, 2024, which is the same day that President Biden announced this peace plan. And I believe, if I am remembering correctly, that was, let's see, if today is a Tuesday, that would mean that that was a Friday? I don't know. Doesn't matter. Anyways, President Joe Biden asserted Friday, yes, it was a Friday, that Hamas has been degraded to a point where it can no longer carry out the type of attack that launched the current 8-month conflict in Gaza, laying out a 3-phase proposal Israel has submitted to wind down the grinding crisis, as he declared it is time for the war to end. Now, brief correction here. It is true that Hamas has been beaten down something fierce in this current conflict. They have definitely never taken a beating like this in their entire existence. They began to exist, I believe 1987 is when they actually started, even though 1988 is when they published their charter. And they fought many different times against Israel. The largest fight they had against Israel up until this point was the 2006 Gaza War, or 2005 Gaza War, excuse me, which was fairly deadly, but was not even close to what has been happening in this current conflict. As I said, roughly 35,000 people have been killed in this current conflict. Now, of course, not all of those people have been, not civilians. Some of them have been civilians, is my point. Not all of those people have been Hamas militants. In fact, Hamas at its strongest started the war with 40,000. And what I mean by at its strongest is that it is the most liberal estimate of their strength, the lower estimates of their strength being somewhere around the 20,000 mark. So obviously not all 35,000 of those deaths have been Hamas militants. A good deal of them have certainly been Gaza citizens. As far as how many militants have been killed, we're not exactly sure. It's believed to be somewhere around, say, 16,000. At least that's what the numbers seem to suggest at the moment. Roughly 1,600 soldiers in the Israeli army have been killed, as well as 746 members of their security forces, according to various statistics that we have been able to find online. So this is a bigger beating than they have ever taken in their entire life. And in that regard, President Biden is certainly saying something accurate. Now, have they been destroyed to the point of not being able to retaliate? That is absolutely not the case. And there's a couple different ways that we can. And by the way, I'm getting word here that I actually got the year wrong both times. It was 2008 that the Gaza War took place. So my apologies about that. At any rate, the terrorist organization known as Hamas has actually launched rocket attacks into Israel as recently as last Friday. Today is June the 11th, 2024. Let's see, today is a Tuesday, so 10, 9, 8, that would be the 7th. Yeah, there you go, right? June the 7th is the last time we've seen any rockets flying into Israel. The Iron Dome, of course, was able to stop all of it, but the fact of the matter is they are still fully capable of attacking Israel within the currently accepted borders of Israel. And the other fact of the matter is nobody thought they were capable of carrying out the attack that they did, in fact, carry out on October the 7th until it happened, right? So it is true that they have been fundamentally degraded in a way in which they had never been degraded before. It is not true that they have been degraded to the point of not being able to fight back against the Israelis. In fact, that's one of the arguments for peace in Israel, is that a lot of people in Israel are worried that this may turn into a Taliban-esque quagmire where you're never actually able to get rid of, the terrorist organizations which you are fighting. Now, to be fair, Israel is going about this a heck of a lot more violently than America did, which I actually think is a good thing. Why do I think that's a good thing? Because part of the reason that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS as well have all survived their wars with America is because we kind of were pussyfooting around, to be honest with you, right? We were pulling punches. And as a result, these people did not find themselves completely obliterated when our overwhelming military might could have easily done so. And in fact, we know that it could have easily done so because when we weren't pulling punches in 2003, it took us mere weeks to overthrow the Taliban government in Afghanistan, right? So Israel is going about this the way we should have gone about that. And as a result, I have a lot more confidence in their abilities to take out Hamas than I did than I would have, I was way too young, in America's abilities to take out the terrorist organizations which we were fighting. That all being said, I just wanted to clarify the record. It is not true that Hamas has been degraded to the point of being unable to fight, as President Biden is suggesting. It would be nice if that were true. It is simply not true at the moment. And I'll let you know a little bit of my personal thoughts on this peace plan in a moment. But suffice it to say, I don't think that is acceptable, and I'll explain why after this article. Returning, it was perhaps the furthest Biden has gone in telling Israel its stated goals for its operation in Gaza have been met, which is not true. and that the time has arrived to stop the fighting as part of a hostage deal. Now, remember, they had two goals actually three goals as far as their invasion was concerned. Number one was to get all the hostages back. Number two was to completely obliterate Hamas, destroy them, wipe them off the planet. And I mean that the reason I keep repeating that is because they meant it literally. They wanted the organization gone. And number three was to replace Hamas with some organization that was, at the very least, less terroristic, if not more friendly to Israel and the United States, to govern the Gaza Strip, which is a pretty important clarification considering a lot of people have accused Israel of wanting to annex the Gaza Strip, which, for the record, I would prefer if they did, but they're not going to. Quote, at this point, Hamas no longer is capable of carrying out another October 7th, just one of Israel's main objectives in the war, and quite frankly, a righteous one, end quote, Biden said at the White House. And to be fair, he's right about that. It is certainly a righteous cause. Though I don't think he's right about their inability to actually carry it out. He had just laid out a three-phase Israeli proposal that would pair a release of hostages with a full and complete ceasefire, a plan he said presented the best hope to bring peace to Gaza. Quote, this is a truly decisive moment, end quote, he said. Biden said the Israeli proposal was transmitted this week. The first phase would last 6 weeks and would include, quote, the withdrawal of Israeli forces from all populated areas of Gaza and release of a number of hostages, including women, the elderly, the wounded, in exchange for the release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, end quote. Now, brief pause here. This is one of the first areas where I ought to say I flatly disagree. First off, it's not entirely clear what he means by populated areas. Does he mean currently populated areas, or does he mean population centers as they existed before the war? Because as many of you may know, a great deal of Gazans have actually fled northern Gaza into southern Gaza. And as a result, a lot of those areas are no longer populated, those people being refugees and displaced, right? So does he want them simply out of Rafah and other cities which are currently populated? Or does he mean he wants them out of all population centers as they existed before the war? Biden did not clarify that and thus far has not clarified anything further. Furthermore, it's just fundamentally bad business to be on the winning side and yet give up more for peace. What do I mean by that? Well, not to put these lives in a position where they are merely pawns, where they're merely business, where they're merely things to be won. But Israel's currently winning the conflict, and for them to give up more terrorist prisoners than hostages that were taken to begin with, let alone hostages that may currently be alive and in Hamas's possession at this moment, is just stupid. It's just a dumb idea. And frankly, if I were the state of Israel, I wouldn't be giving up any of my prisoners if these prisoners had been confirmed Hamas militants. It's a terrorist organization. We simply should not be negotiating with terrorists, I would say. And I hope that they end up sticking to their guns and arguing in such a manner, because you shouldn't be negotiating with terrorists. You shouldn't tell people you can violently attack us. You can slaughter millions of women, of children, of elderly, of innocent men who are not involved in the military. You can rape women, all this other kind of stuff, right? You can take these prisoners. You can use your own citizens as human shields. And we're going to reward you for that by giving you more terrorists with which to commit these atrocities next time around. Sorry, but no cigar, buddy. And somebody might say, well, then what's the bargaining chip? The bargaining chip is that I stop bombing the crap out of you. You know what I mean? Like, I don't understand where we are in the world. I remember, I'm a big Civil War nerd. And I remember reading about Ulysses S. Grant. He ended up getting the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant, which, while not very catchy, was definitely something that was a gut punch to the Confederates. And it was because I believe it's the Battle of Fort Donelson. It might have been the Battle of Shiloh. Fairly certain it's the Battle of Fort Donelson. Maybe somebody can correct me in the live chat. The Confederate commander, when he was ready to give up, when he was like, we've had enough, we've taken enough, he sends a letter to Grant saying, what are your terms? And Grant says, no terms, unconditional surrender. You surrender, you don't give me any conditions. The condition is I'm going to stop killing you. You know what I mean? And of course they did, because Grant had him beat, right? So I think that's the way Israel should be operating here. If we are going to have peace, and I don't necessarily think that we should yet, obviously we want peace. And by we, I mean human beings, right? And certainly me, I'll speak for myself. I'm using the royal we here, but I'll speak for myself. I want peace. I don't like it that Palestinian civilians are dying. I don't like it, that churches and mosques and historical sites are being destroyed and we'll never get them back. I don't like any of that. I don't like the fact that women and children in Gaza are fleeing their homes. But with that being said, this war was started by an act of vile, heinous aggression on the part of Hamas. Hamas is losing the war. Ergo, Hamas does not actually have any right to be demanding anything. They either should be destroyed, which is my personal belief, and which, by the way, would avoid future wars. The only way you're going to avoid future wars is by eliminating Hamas, destroy them. Okay, if they're around, they can always come back. North Korea and South Korea can tell you something about that. Armenia and Azerbaijan can tell you something about that. Ukraine and Russia can tell you something about that. Georgia and Russia can tell you something about that. Oh, you know who else can tell you something about that? Hamas and Israel, because this is like the third or fourth war they fought with each other. Not to mention all of the different, little back and forth skirmishes that they've had over the years, where they shot a couple rockets here and there, and then the Israelis retaliated with a couple of their own rockets. You know what I mean? So obviously, these things are very important as far as rendering your enemy completely incapable of fighting. But if you're not going to take the J plan and wipe Hamas off of the face of the planet, if you're saying there's been too much death, too much destruction, which, to be fair, while I don't agree, I appreciate. I think you guys are making a mistake. I think you're going to lead to more dead in the future. I also understand why you're doing it, because you don't want the immediate deaths that are currently happening. But if that is going to be the case, then the only peace deal should be you give us the hostages and we'll leave. We're not giving you squat. Why? Because we're the ones with the really big bombs and you're not. We're the ones who have your entire little Gaza Strip here on the run. You're not. Okay? Might kind of does make right. I was just reading a comment from a frequent commenter here on the video and personal friend of mine, who was saying we may not like that might makes right, but it kind of just does. It's sort of the way it is. And I'm a little bit paraphrasing him, but nevertheless, it is simply the way it is. Might does make right. The people with the biggest guns are the people with the most authority. The people who have the greatest capacity to commit acts of violence in a given territory are the people who have the authority to tell you what and what not to do. Now, is that authority legitimate under God? Well, that's obviously for God to decide. And in many instances, I would say probably not. There's certainly been a lot of evil tyrants out there, no doubt. But is it legitimate from an earthly perspective? Yeah, it is. It's what makes governments function, right? And it's just simply the way it is. The nation that is the most powerful, or the group that is the most powerful militarily, is the group that is capable of and will end up being the ones who are governing the territory, right? So the only option you should be giving to Hamas is, hey, I'll stop bombing you if you give me all of the hostages. Oh, you want hostages? That's funny. Bomb, 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 bomb. Have you had enough yet? I mean, you know what I mean? I'm sorry if it sounds callous, but it's the way war is. I'm sorry. And by the way, that's the reason that we should be avoiding war at all costs when we can, sometimes it's necessary, is because that's the way war is. Going on a little bit of a rant here, let's continue to go back to the article. He said phase 2 would allow for the exchange and release of the remaining living hostages, including male soldiers. That is on both sides, right? Obviously, some soldiers have been kidnapped by Hamas, or captured, I should say. It's not a kidnap if you're capturing prisoners of war, and vice versa on the other side. Quote, and as long as Hamas lives up to its commitments, which won't happen, the temporary ceasefire would become, in the words of the Israeli proposals, the cessation of hostilities permanently, end quote, Biden said, which, by the way, is another thing to point out that I haven't actually said yet. It's not been revealed who proposed this plan originally, but Biden swears that this plan has come from Israelis. So while he's the one proposing it, apparently the Israelis are the ultimate source of this plan. Which Israelis, we don't necessarily know. We know it's not Netanyahu, and we know it's not Yoav Gallant, because both of them have decided not to accept it, right? Who exactly it is, I'm not sure. I suspect probably President Isaac Herzog, but I'm not sure. In phase 3, the president said a, quote, major reconstruction plan for Gaza would commence, and any final remains of hostages who have been killed will be returned to their families, end quote. This would, of course, mean that they are going to try and rebuild Gaza in the form of an international coalition. And I don't necessarily agree with that either, to be honest with you. Although, I don't know. This is one of those areas where, my Christian duty to love my enemies, and in this case, it's not even my enemies, it's the enemies of somebody who I believe is rightly engaged in war. And my beliefs as far as the way war should be handled, which for the record stem from the Bible, I kind of feel like they're in conflict a little bit. I don't think that I believe you should be rebuilding your enemies after you've destroyed them, right? And I don't know if that's in conflict with the command to love your enemies. Maybe it is. Maybe I'm being hypocritical there. But it doesn't seem like a good idea to me. And that's not even counting the fact that it would be an international coalition doing this, which I am 100% of the time against, every single time. International coalitions are always bad. UN peacekeepers have some of the worst human rights records in the entire world. Barring like the Rwandans committing genocide in the 1990s and stuff like that. The UN peacekeepers are just hellacious in their treatment of civilians, right? And international government is inherently illegitimate, and I think a door that will lead directly to, well, we'll just say eschatology. We'll put it that way, right? So, do with that what you may. I certainly don't want any of my American tax dollars going to rebuild Gaza after Gaza decided to start a war with Israel that it couldn't win. I'm sorry. I do have genuine sympathy for the citizens. At the same time, you started it. You couldn't finish it. Don't start stuff you can't finish. I feel like everybody's mother and father taught them that when they were in grade school, right? Less than an hour after Biden detailed the Israeli proposal, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insisted the country would not end the war until Hamas is defeated. This is what I was just talking about as far as Netanyahu can't be the source of this, or at least it doesn't seem like he's the source of this, because he is rejecting it. Now, of course, he could be playing some kind of a long con. It's possible. He's a politician, and every politician is capable of those kinds of things. I mean, every human is capable of those kinds of things, but obviously politicians kind of like feed off of lies. You know what I mean? And I tend to like Benjamin Netanyahu, but I'm also not deceived. He's a politician like anyone else, and he's even got some shady dealings in his past that we've talked about before on this channel. At any rate, he said, quote, the Israeli government is united in the desire to return our hostages as soon as possible and is working to achieve this goal, end quote. The Prime Minister's office said in a statement. Again, quote, therefore, the Prime Minister authorized the negotiating team to present an outline for achieving this goal while insisting that the war will not end until all of its goals are achieved, including the return of all our hostages and, the elimination of Hamas's military and governmental capabilities, end quote. The Prime Minister's office insisted that the exact outline of Israel's proposal allows Israel to maintain these principles, which by implication, I think means that this has been doctored by the American government. We're probably not getting the original Israeli proposal if Netanyahu thinks that it would allow him to destroy destroy Hamas. My apologies, as it had been originally given it. I was about to say he, but I don't think he is the one who gave it originally. Sorry. The Prime Minister's office insisted I just read that. Shortly after the statement was released, it was announced that the top 4 congressional leaders have formally invited Netanyahu to address a joint meeting of Congress, though no date was specified for it to take place. Fun fact, if that happens, he will be the first foreign head of state, or I guess in this case, be head of government, because the president of Israel is their head of state, but nevertheless, he'd be the first leader of a foreign government, we'll put it that way, to have addressed a joint session of the United States Congress 4 times. He's addressed it 3 times before. He'd be the first to have addressed it 4 times, which is just a little fun piece of trivia for you. Now, Hamas also responded to this, and like Israel, they responded negatively. Hamas released a statement later on Friday saying it viewed the proposal positively. That's a lie. We'll go ahead and get to this in a minute. The Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, views positively what was included in U.S. President Joe Biden's speech today. The statement said the movement affirms its position of readiness to deal positively and constructively with any proposals based on a permanent ceasefire, complete withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, reconstruction, the return of the disabled or displaced to their places of residence, and the completion of a serious prisoner exchange deal if the occupation declares its explicit commitment of that. And don't worry, we'll get to the portion where I said this is a lie in just a moment, but it's going to be in a different article. Former President Barack Obama, in a rare statement about current events, said the ceasefire proposal is clear, realistic, and just, which of course should immediately cue you into the fact that it is muddy, unrealistic, and does shame to the cause of justice. Why? Because Obama said it and he's wrong about everything. Of course, I'm kidding about that. He's not literally wrong about everything. I'm sure he knows 2 + 2 = 4, but maybe not. Who knows? Quote, a ceasefire alone won't ease the terrible pain of Israelis whose loved ones were butchered or abducted by Hamas, or the Palestinians whose families have been shattered by the subsequent war, Obama said. It won't resolve the long-standing conflict between Israelis and Palestinians or answer contentious issues surrounding a two-state solution or continuing settler activity in the West Bank. But what it can do is put a stop to the ongoing bloodshed, help families reunite, and allow a surge of humanitarian aid to help desperate, hungry people, end quote. So we're not going to read the rest of this article. There's a link to it in the in the description below if you would like to read it. But we have other articles we want to get to that describe some of the responses to this kind of thing. Let me get another drink of this tea. Sorry. We already saw Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's response to it. Well, now let's go ahead and see some other members of the Israeli government and what they have had to say about it. And I think you will find this incredibly interesting for numerous reasons. Once again, reading an article from Certainly Not News. This one titled, 2 far-right Israeli ministers threaten to topple the government if it accepts the Biden peace plan. Now, this is incredibly important because, for those of you who don't know, I've explained this a couple other times on this program, but who knows, we might have new viewers. For those of you who do not know, Israel is a parliamentary republic, which means that the way that you vote for politicians in Israel, very similar to the way you vote for politicians in, for example, Great Britain, is you actually vote for parties, and it's a multi-party system. So what do those two things mean? Well, let's say you have 100 seats, and the party with the majority of the votes, the plurality, gets 40 seats, or it got 40% of the votes, right? The secondary party will say gets 30% of the votes, and typically, because people tend to gravitate towards the larger parties in each side, those are going to be at odds with each other. One of them is going to be right wing, one of them is going to be left wing, in other words, right? That's usually the way it goes. But notice you got 30 other seats left. All those seats then get filled up by various smaller parties. Say one wins 15, one wins 5, a couple others win 3, so on and so forth, right? Well, now, after the election takes place, each party, first off, fills up those seats with the party officials who they deem worthy to govern. And secondly, now has to form a coalition to try and get 51 of those seats in a functioning government. Why? Well, because obviously you're going to need over half, a majority, in other words, to actually get anything done, right? So if you have 51 seats, then you can obviously get stuff passed. And if you get 60, then that's 60%. You can get even more stuff passed, depending on the various checks and balances that exist within your own government. Sometimes you get up to 2/3, right? So on and so forth. So that party then has to start making deals with other parties saying, all right, so you guys have this particular proposal you really would like to see done. You have these 3 proposals that nobody agrees with. I'm not going to do those, but I can do this one that you guys really want. Or I'm not going to do this one you really want, but I can do those other 3 if you decide to come over to my side and form a functioning government. You start making these compromises. Okay, you don't really like my plan A. Fine, I won't do my plan A if you come over to my side of this government, so on and so forth, right? And then you end up forming coalitions that way. Typically, you will end up forming coalitions with people on your side of the political spectrum. In other words, the right-wing party, if it wins, will have more right-wing parties or center-right parties. And the left-wing party, if it wins, will have more left-wing parties or center-right parties in its coalition. Typically, not always, but that's typically the way it goes, right? Benjamin Netanyahu is not popular in the Israeli government, and he's only half popular amongst Israeli citizens, by which I mean those who love him, and those who hate him despise him. He's very much Trumpian in that regard. So, as a result, the people who make up the coalition government in Israel currently are typically on the very far right of the Israeli political spectrum. This includes groups like Israeli nationalists. This includes groups like Orthodox Jewish fundamentalists who seek to have halakha passed throughout the state of Israel. This very often can include racist parties, unfortunately. Now, obviously, just like in America, some parties are accused of racist without actually being so, but some are genuinely so. So, take that title there with a grain of salt. Being against, for example, citizenship of non-Jews in the state of Israel is not necessarily racist, but when you refer to all Arabs as dogs, you probably are racist, right? So because of the current situation, that is what Benjamin Netanyahu has had to work with is these far right parties, most of which are far right in the sense that they are what's called Hardal, which basically means Haredi nationalist or ultra Orthodox nationalist. People like Rabbi Meir Kahane, although they tend to be a little bit farther away from his views than he had originally liked, right? I know that this is a whole lot to take in at once, but essentially this is what it all boils down to. This is what it means. He needs to keep those far-right members of his political coalition happy, or they will break away from the coalition and they will go back to having a new election cycle wherein Netanyahu may actually end up losing. And by the way, if he loses, he no longer has immunity and will end up having trials for various things he's accused of in Israel, including but not limited to taking bribes, right? So that is all incentive for Benjamin Netanyahu to reject this plan if he can't keep his government intact while doing so. And with these two far-right Israeli ministers threatening to dissolve the government, it seems he will not be able to do so if he accepts this plan, right? So this one right here is Bezalel Smotrich, I think is how you say his last name. And he is the current Israeli finance minister. This is National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, and they are the two ministers who are currently threatening to dissolve the government at the moment if, in fact, he accepts this peace plan. Let's read on. Two far-right Israeli ministers have threatened to resign and bring down the governing coalition of Benjamin Netanyahu if he accepts a peace proposal laid out by U.S. President Joe Biden. Biden unveiled on Friday what he said was a three-phase Israeli proposal to end the conflict in Gaza that would pair a release of hostages with a full and complete ceasefire. During a speech at the White House, Biden said Hamas had been degraded to a point where it could no longer carry out this type of attack that was seen on October the 7th, which, as I said, is just flatly false, which launched the current war in Gaza. Quote, "It's time for this war to end," he said, a clear indication that, as far as he is concerned, Israel's war goals have been met. But the Israeli government's two most prominent far-right ministers, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, made it explicitly clear that they reject an immediate ceasefire. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has also signaled he is not ready either, meaning he's actually in agreement with them, and he said it before them. So it may be that he legitimately disagrees with the deal and is not just simply trying to save his own political skin, but this is also a reason for him to reject the deal, in that it will end up burning him if he does accept it. In a statement on social media, Smotrich said he has made it clear to Netanyahu that he would not be part of a government. He would, quote, "not be part of a government that will agree to the proposed outline and end the war without destroying Hamas and returning all the hostages," end quote, which, of course, is exactly what Netanyahu said himself. Smotrich demanded the fighting to continue, until, quote, "the complete destruction of Hamas and the return of all hostages, as well as the creation of a completely different security reality in Gaza and Lebanon," end quote, which is to say that Hamas is done away with, and whoever is ruling over Gaza or governing over Gaza would be probably more accurate because it's not a nation. Whoever does that is not Hamas, basically. That's some other organization that is maintaining the peace and the government and the water pipelines and all that kind of stuff in Gaza is not, in fact, Hamas, right? He mentions Lebanon here as well because of Hezbollah. Unfortunately for Smotrich, that's just not going to happen without this war escalating dramatically. And while I'm definitely giving off Warhawk vibes up here, I can say I definitely do not think that Israel should escalate the war by going after Hezbollah. So far, Hezbollah and Israel have been doing their tit-for-tat nonsense, and I think it's better that it's kept that way so that the entire Middle East doesn't turn into a gigantic fireball, the likes of which only Mordor has seen. Quote, if the prime minister implements the reckless deal under the conditions published today, which mean the end of the war and the giving up the elimination of Hamas, Otzma Yehudit, which is his party, will dissolve the government, end quote, he said, referring to the far-right party he leads and which helps prop up Netanyahu's majority in parliament. Excuse me. Netanyahu had alluded to the tensions of the Israeli government in his speech, making a direct appeal to ordinary Israelis to voice their support. Quote, I know there are those in Israel who will not agree with this plan and will call for the war to continue indefinitely. Some are even in the government coalition, end quote, he said. Now, for the record, I actually agree with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in this regard. And in fact, I'll be honest with you, I tend to agree with them in most things as it pertains to Israeli politics. Of course, it's their country, not mine, so they're going to do whatever they want. But I do tend to agree with a lot of their policies. I don't agree with all of them, specifically the way they treat Christians and Messianic Jews, which is just Christian Jews, in Israel. I certainly don't agree with that. And I don't agree with their treatment of Karaite Jews either. They're part of the reason why Messianic Jews and Karaite Jews find themselves under persecution in the state of Israel is because of men like Ben-Gvir, which is something that I find to be incredibly problematic. But as far as policy beyond that, unfortunately, and this is one of the sad realities of Israeli politics, they tend to be right about most things. And this, I think, is one of them. Biden is saying your war goals have been met. The fact of the matter is Israel's war goals haven't been met. Hamas still exists. Their military wing is still active. They're still capable of attacking Israel within the borders that we currently which are currently agreed upon as Israel's borders, right, by all nations involved. They still have much of their leadership intact and so on and so forth. So their war goals haven't actually been met. And it's ridiculous to think that this won't lead to more carnage down the line. Now, again, I do wish that somebody else was saying this. I wish there was a party out there that was loyal to Torah, that was loyal to Israeli nationalism, that was sane about the way you carry out wars, that was capitalistic, all the different things that we like here in America, right? And which nevertheless was not Christ haters. That would obviously be ideal. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist in the state of Israel, and that's part of the reason I think that the government is in such a terrible position right now, because all the people that are right hate Jesus, and all the people that are wrong pay him no mind whatsoever. Which, what can I say, man? I think he's the actual God, so you can't go by hating him or paying him no mind whatsoever and have a functioning, prosperous society. It's just the way that it is. So, what we do with that, I don't know, but regardless, I find that they are correct as it pertains to the Gazan War. It is, in fact, the case that their war goals have not been met. It is, in fact, the case that Hamas, will rebuild, right? And when they rebuild, they will end up attacking again, because that's just simply the way it always goes. I'm reminded of the Rabbi Meir Kahane, who is somebody I have a lot of retroactive respect for. I say retroactive because he was assassinated in 1990. I wasn't even born yet, right? I tend to have a lot of respect for Rabbi Meir Kahane, even though he was amongst the numbers of the Christ haters. So there, you have to parse that respect in certain ways. I respect a lot of the stuff he said politically. He was a man blessed with much intellect and wisdom. At the same time, he was also a man who ultimately was on the wrong side of righteousness and probably did more damage than good ultimately as a result. That being said, one thing he was right about is he would point out, he wanted to annex Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, and he wanted to depopulate it by what's the word here when you deport? That's what it is. By deporting all Arabs in those regions who were not willing to sign away their political rights. Now, for those who don't know what that means, you have two different kind of categories of rights. You have your political rights. You might call those your civil rights. And you have human rights, which we tend to in America call civil rights, but which are in fact not civil rights at all. Political rights include things like voting, right? Running for public office. They do not include things like having a trial by jury or the right to freedom of speech or the right to freedom of religion and things of that nature. And basically the idea was non-Jews in the state of Israel would not have their political rights, but they would have their personal or human rights. Essentially the same way we would treat non-citizens here in America, right? The difference there being that you would have to be considered Jewish in order to be a citizen. One thing I did actually appreciate about Kahana, although he did not show them any love, he did recognize that Jewish Christians were in fact Jews, and so they would have their political rights in his particular state of Israel, something his followers like Ben-Gvir have seemed to toss out the window. I digress on that. The point there being he wanted to annex these regions, depopulate these areas through deportation, and when people asked him, like, how could you do such a thing? He would say, look, we're just going to continue to fight indefinitely unless the problem is solved. Okay. We either win or they win. And the only other option besides that is perpetual conflict until one of those two things ends up happening. Right. And the same is true today, and the same is true in any conflict situation that has ever existed in the history of this planet. You have winners and losers. You don't have a situation where both go home happy or both go home unhappy. It's not a thing. Okay. We could have chosen to just have a ceasefire with the Nazis, or to just have a ceasefire with the Confederate South, or to just have a ceasefire with England. And you know what would have happened? Another war within a decade. 100% would have happened. It's the way it always works. Somebody has to win and win decisively, or you will have more bloodshed down the road, right? One way you could kind of think about this is if you're in a fight with somebody who hates you or with somebody who you hate, right? And you both punch each other in the face a couple of times and decide to call it quits, you think you guys are going to end up fighting again? Well, yeah, you didn't solve the hatred, right? Especially if he's the one who hates you and he's hell-bent on killing you. Oh, wow, well, my face hurts a little bit. I think I might have a concussion. Hey, let me rest for a minute and we'll have peace. No, that's not the way it's going to work. Now, if you snap his leg, it might be the way it works because he can't do anything anymore. He's crippled. You know what I mean? I know that sounds brutal and violent. It's also just the way that warfare works. I'm sorry, but it is. And so that's just a way of me saying I tend to agree with Ben-Gvir in this regard, despite the fact that I tend to find him a rather deplorable human being. Now, with that being said, regardless of if I agree with Ben-Gvir or not, the fact of the matter is he has a good deal of power over the current Israeli government and therefore over Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which means that this peace plan will probably not be accepted, because if it's accepted and you can't get Otzma Yehudit on board and Ben-Gvir on board, and they end up dissolving the government, and you have to have another round of elections, and Benjamin Netanyahu cannot form a coalition government, and therefore his opponents end up winning. You see what I'm saying, right? It's just a domino effect from there. It's a snowball effect from there. And as a result, Benjamin Netanyahu may want to completely avoid that by just saying, no, we're not going to accept the peace proposal. If he can't avoid that, then the only other option is to not accept the peace proposal. And I don't think he will as a result. And interestingly enough, this is something which we've seen a couple of Israeli soldiers and veterans actually respond to. And they have said things very similar to what Ben-Gvir and what I am saying right now, and what Netanyahu has also kind of hinted at in his own response. Israelis on front lines this year is from freebeacon.com. Israelis on front lines say Biden's peace plan is forcing them to fight a forever war. For those of you who don't know what a forever war is, just, read the words. It's pretty obvious. It's a war that goes on forever, right? President Joe Biden has admonished Israelis to stop waging indefinite war and embrace his plan for Middle East peace. But more than half a dozen war-weary Israeli reserve soldiers from across the country told the Washington Free Beacon that Biden's diplomacy is actually dragging out the Gaza war, which he is pressing Israel to bring to an end. By restraining Israel, they said, Biden is preventing the Jewish state from defeating or deterring its genocidal enemies. Quote, it's very frustrating, end quote, said Sinir Tal, 24-year-old reservist in an elite Israeli Defense Forces commando unit. Tull saw two of his best friends killed during 6 months of service in the war on the Gaza Strip, which the Palestinian terrorist group known as Hamas started with a massacre and mass abduction in southern Israel on October the 7th, 2023 to be exact, but they don't specify. It feels like, quote, it feels like all our work and all our losses were for nothing. I don't think Biden really understands this neighborhood, end quote, said Emil Grishfun, who's 40, a finance ministry official and infantry reservist who volunteered on October the 7th and served 4.5 months in the West Bank. Well, we're doing the job, so let us finish the job. Otherwise, it will be like this until the end of time, end quote. Another quote from another man by the name of Ente Inbar says, the U.S. is really strong-arming us and not letting us have the military might that we need to win, end quote. Inbar is 34 and a principal at a Tel Aviv venture capital fund and military intelligence reservist who has been involved in the search for Israeli hostages. He says also, quote, what we need to do is come to a conclusion quickly, but we need to come to a positive conclusion for us so that we don't have to face the same thing a decade from now, end quote. And by the way, this hints at something else that I've been saying on here numerous times. It's not just Israel. It's actually a lot of different countries. The Saudis fit into this category. The Philippines fit into this category. South Korea, fits into this category. There's a lot of conspiracy theorists out there who think that because we give so much money to Israel every year and because they have such a large political PAC in our government, that therefore means the Americans are kind of bought off by the Israelis. It actually means the exact opposite is true. The Israelis are bought off by the Americans, and they essentially function as the 51st state, with 52nd, 53rd, 54th, and so on being the other countries that we give a bunch of money to and then eventually tell them, hey, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. They don't have any sovereignty, in other words, right? This is yet another example of precisely that. If Israel was a sovereign nation, then they would just do whatever they felt necessary. And whether or not America or anybody else had to say anything about that, then, well, move on. I mean, every country has to deal with other countries being mad about the stuff they do. People are mad at America all the time. We just don't care, right? And we shouldn't, by the way. But because Israel is not a sovereign country, because Israel is actually beholden to the United States government, like many other governments across the world are, it's not just Israel. But because of that, when they say, hey, we want to just take out Hamas, and the United States government says, no, I don't think you should be allowed to do that anymore because this, that, and the third, Israel then ends up being kind of hamstrung, or they don't get the benefits of being a American quote unquote ally. And I say quote unquote because we actually do not have a treaty with Israel, nor do we have a treaty with most of the nations that we are quote unquote allied with, which is a problem, by the way, because that's literally what defines an ally in geopolitics, is that you have some kind of a mutual defense pact or other treaty. And on top of that, I think the soldiers are exactly right. They're saying the same thing Ben Gvir is saying, the same thing I'm saying, the same thing Netanyahu is saying, the same thing many American politicians said about Al-Qaeda when we were involved in the war on terror, which is you cannot sit here and pussyfoot around, right? You cannot sit here and play patty cake with these guys and expect to win the war. That's not how wars are won, right? That's not how wars are won at all. And frankly, all you do is prolong the war by doing these sorts of things. Look, it's no coincidence that the Vietnam War lasted 21 years and World War II lasted 6, right? It's because World War II, we went in with the intention to win. And so we beat the crap out of our enemies, knowing that they would do the same to us if they got the opportunity. And as a result, the war was very deadly. It was very violent, but it was over. It was over. We won. We've never had to deal with Nazi Germany again. We've never had to deal with fascist Italy again. We've never had to deal with imperialist Japan again. In fact, 2 of those countries, Germany and Japan, are now friends of ours, kind of. They're friends in the same way Israel's friends, right? No treaties. That's not a coincidence. Meanwhile, Vietnam and America still don't get along, and we lost, and the war lasted 21 years and caused about 2 million Vietnamese people to die anyhow. So it's not as if you actually stopped the violence by dragging it on forever. No, you just dragged it on forever. But it was just as violent. It was just as destructive. The country economically has not actually recovered, even though it ended in 1975, which means if you were born the year the Vietnam War ended, if you were born the year that Saigon fell, right, then you would be turning 50 next year. Be 49 this year. That's 50 years nearly. And yet you still haven't economically recovered. We're still not friends. There's still plenty of people who are traumatized from the war. It lasted 21 years. So if you were born when the war started in 1954, you could legally buy a beer in the United States of America circa 2024 when it ended. 2 million people died. It didn't solve anything. We saw another example of this in the war in Afghanistan, right? 2003, we entered. 2021, we leave, which means if you were born when we entered, you could vote when we left. We lost. We murdered millions. We traumatized an entire nation. We spent billions, if not trillions of dollars. And as I said, the war lasted 18 years, right? This is what happens when you fight wars like pansies. And people might say, well, Jay, aren't you the one who's constantly saying things like we should avoid war at all costs? Absolutely, we should. War should be the very last resort. Nobody should ever be happy about going to war. But if you get to the last resort, you go to war. You mobilize. You destroy your enemy. You render them completely incapable of fighting back. And lest anyone think I'm being overtly cruel, this is not only the way everybody understood it for thousands of years up until hippies started being elected in public spaces, but it's also a very deeply biblical principle. I know not everybody who watches this is a Christian because this is a political channel and not a religious channel. However, the tagline is we're living in biblical times, is it not? And, well, suffice it to say the Amalekites and the Canaanites and even the Egyptians, even though that wasn't the Israeli army, that was God, they certainly weren't they weren't having a patty cake played with them or jump rope or hopscotch, right? They were destroyed utterly. And only then was there peace, right? As Ronald Reagan used to say, peace through strength. Peace through strength. So, soldiers on the ground don't like it. The far-right ministers don't like it. Netanyahu doesn't seem to like it. Well, what about the members of Hamas? How do they feel about it? Well, they originally said they kind of liked it, but they're not 100% honest with that. They actually have certain problems that they have with it because it doesn't fulfill exactly what they would like. So this is from the Financial Times. Hamas and the Islamic Jihad respond to Joe Biden's Gaza peace plan. The Palestinian militant groups offer amendments to U.S.-backed proposals with talks to continue via mediators, says the Financial Times here. Going on here to the article, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad on Tuesday gave their response to the plan set out by U.S. President Joe Biden this month to end the 8-month-old war in Gaza. That is today, Tuesday, by the way. In a statement, the two groups expressed, quote, readiness to deal positively, end quote, to reach an agreement, and said their response, quote, prioritizes the interest of our Palestinian people, end quote, the necessity of completely ending the war, and, quote, withdrawing Israeli forces from the entire Gaza Strip, end quote. And of course, you guys should be familiar with that statement because we already read it. However, they did not provide details, and an official with knowledge of the talks said the response contained, quote, amendments, end quote, to the Israeli proposal, including a timeline for a permanent ceasefire and the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. The official said Hamas's response was, quote, neither a yes nor a no, and added that the group was seeking assurances about a permanent ceasefire, which has been a sticking point between the two sides, adding that talks would continue via mediators to see if a deal could be reached. Qatar and Egypt, which along with the U.S. have been central to the efforts to broker a deal, confirmed that they had received a response from the Palestinian factions and would continue their mediation efforts, quote, until an agreement is reached, end quote. Now, it is important to note that Israel actually completely withdrew from the Gaza Strip either in 2005 or 2006. I can't remember exactly when. And we're actually ready to give the Gaza Strip a level of autonomy, though their state, quote unquote, was not actually going to be recognized. But they were able to vote in their own elections, which they did. They elected Hamas, actually, which was more or less running, I wouldn't say completely unopposed. There were certainly other parties involved, but they were definitely the most powerful faction. They elected Hamas willingly. They ended up governing the region themselves with no Israeli interference. And so this kind of permanent ceasefire thing that they're talking about, it was already the case. There was no Israeli soldiers there. There was no Israeli government officials there. They were governing the region themselves. For all intents and purposes, it was kind of a Palestinian state. And yet they ended up attacking anyway, and not just on October the 7th. This is one of many conflicts that Hamas and Israel have fought since the 2005 withdrawal from the Gaza Strip on the part of Israel, right? So how much can you really trust this notion that they're saying, hey, we want a complete and total ceasefire, which, again, they are adding stuff to this, like the article says here. It's neither a yes or a no, right? They're not nearly as positive to it as they initially said in their first statement. But even if they were, how could you trust it? How could you trust it? This is something you already had, and yet they still attacked you. This is something that you already had, and yet they still attacked you a second time. This is something you already had, and yet they continued to fire rockets from time to time, 2014, 2016, 2020, 2022, so on and so forth. And this is something you still had, and October the 7th still ended up occurring. So how can you trust them? Well, the answer is quite simple. You can't. You can't, right? You can't trust an organization who has in their charter, as part of their charter, not only the complete and total destruction of the state of Israel, but also the retaking of all Islamic lands, which they define as lands that have ever been under the control of Muslims, which, in case anybody's curious, by the by, would include lands like, Albania and the rest of the Balkans, for that matter, sans Greece and Spain and Portugal, and maybe even Dearborn, Michigan. I don't know. I don't know what exactly they mean by control, but I do know that the mayor of Dearborn, Michigan, and their entire city council is Muslim, and they also have a majority Muslim population. And you can definitely hear Islamic calls to prayer within the city limits of Dearborn, Michigan, right? So now, does Hamas have the power to carry that out? Well, currently, no. But the point is, you can't make peace with an organization like that. There are certain groups that, because of their belief, not because they're especially evil, human beings are all evil, but because of the beliefs they espouse, there are certain groups you simply cannot make peace with. Hamas is one of them. The response comes 2 weeks after Biden set out a 3-stage peace plan for ending this war, which has become the deadliest in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and fueled a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, as we've said very often here on this channel. During a visit to Israel on Tuesday, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken told journalists that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had also, quote, reaffirmed his commitment, end quote, to the plan, which Biden presented to an Israeli proposal as an Israeli proposal when it was unveiled. Again, put an asterisk by that. We read the statement that Netanyahu gave, and he himself has actually said that he wants complete and total destruction of Hamas. So he's not exactly on board with this plan either. Anthony Blinken did say he was, and maybe he was told that. I don't know. I don't put lying above Benjamin Netanyahu any more than I put it above Anthony Blinken. But we heard him speak with his own lips, and he certainly is not happy with this proposed peace plan. Pressing forward, let's see. Although Israeli, let me go ahead and scroll down. I don't know if anybody actually reads the screens here, but maybe you do. Although Israeli officials have admitted the proposal was accepted by the war cabinet, so that'd be Yoav Gallant, which I actually said he would not be involved earlier. So my apologies. That was a needed correction on my part, which has directed the country's campaign in Gaza. The plan has sparked a backlash from far-right factions of the government, with 2 ultranationalist parties threatening to topple Netanyahu's government if he accepts it, which we already pointed out. Earlier on Tuesday, an Israeli official reiterated that the country would not end the war until it had achieved all of its goals, which included the destruction of Hamas and the return of all hostages seized by the militant group in its October 7th attack, which triggered the conflict. It's interesting also, I'd just like to point out that nobody is mentioning what started this conflict to begin with, which was, number one, Hamas feeling like the status quo on the Temple Mount was being threatened because of the arrival of red heifers into Israel, which so far nothing has actually happened as a result of that. They haven't been sacrificed. Tonight's obviously the first day of Shavuot, which is these next 3 days is the last time, according to the timeline they had set up, where these red heifers are supposed to be sacrificed. So we'll see what happens. But nevertheless, if that ends up going by just like Passover did, And just like the first Shabbat of Aviv did, or Nisan, depending on what you call the month, um, just like those pass by, if Shavuot ends up passing by and these red heifers aren't sacrificed, then maybe Hamas isn't concerned about that anymore, even though it was one of the key things to start the war, because it doesn't appear it's going to happen. I don't necessarily know. Obviously, the Israeli government hasn't been really big on building a third temple, so who knows? But it is one of the reasons that Hamas said they were starting the war, is because they feared the status quo. Because of these red heifers, they feared the status quo, at the Al-Aqsa Mosque was actually being threatened. Another one of the things that is believed to be a key reason for the start of this war, although it hasn't actually manifested yet, in other words, nobody has actually said it, right, is the potential for Saudi-Israeli relations to be normalized, and even for them to go as far as having an alliance. Why? Because both of them are very much anti-Israel, or excuse me, anti-Iran, and fear the power of Iran as well as their apocalyptic ideology, wherein they will be bringing in the Mahdi, which is the so-called um, uh, Muslim Messiah, as some of us would call it. But I don't know if they would necessarily agree with that terminology per se. Interestingly enough, though, throughout all these articles, neither of those two things are being mentioned. I mention it to you guys now just to say, be wary, because these two reasons not being addressed means that they will rear their ugly head again at some point. The official added that, quote, the outline that was presented allows Israel to meet these conditions, and it will indeed do so, end quote, which again is a quotation which we have already read. All right, so one other thing I do want to mention here really quick is the UNSC did pass Biden's peace plan for Gaza. It was a 14-0 vote, so all 14 members of the UNSC did end up passing it. Hamas in this particular meeting, by the way, UNSC means United Nations Security Council, for those of you who are curious. Hamas did seem to accept this UN resolution. That took place earlier today, although technically it would have been yesterday, not only because it's late, but because June 11th actually happens earlier for them in the old world than it does for us in the new world because of the way time zones work. I believe Israel is 8 hours ahead of us, if I remember correctly, which means right now it's 11:47 p.m. for me. It would be 7:47 a.m. on June the 12th for them. Nevertheless, that is a wrinkle into this plan that is only just starting. UN Security Council passed it by a 14-0 vote. Only Russia was abstaining, and it appears that this is something that Hamas is going to accept. It's also very rare, in that it is a Israeli Arab peace plan that is accepted both by the Western nations, US, France, UK, etc., and some of the Eastern nations, in particular China, because as I said, Russia ended up abstaining from the vote. So that was certainly very important. Another detail of this that is very important is that the G7 leaders fully endorsed the Gaza peace plan, according to an article from Reuters. The G7 being a group of 7 major democracies that are considered to be the most economically powerful nations in the Western democratic world. We didn't read those 2 articles, but just like all the articles that we did read, you can find articles explaining all of that in full in the description down below. There should be, if I am remembering correctly, 6 different articles down there, the 4 we read and the 2 describing the UN and the G7 and everything that they had done. So all of that stuff is incredibly interesting as well, but unfortunately we don't really have time to read those. So what exactly does all of this mean? We've read the peace plan, or at least we've read the details of it. We haven't read the whole thing in full. And we've also read that Israel seems to be queasy about it, but is also indicating they kind of like it. The Israeli government is being threatened internally if it does accept it by far-right factions that say they are not willing to accept it. Netanyahu has said that he believes this allows him to complete his goals, while saying that his goals are things which are directly contradicted by the peace plan. And the Hamas leaders say they accept it and have accepted the UN Security Council resolution, while at the same time not giving an official yes or no to it. So, in other words, they're saying they accept it, but they're not actually accepting it, and they have allegedly proposed some amendments. So, what does it all mean? Well, ultimately, I think what it all means is that it's not going to happen. I think this peace plan is ultimately going to be rejected. But why are we talking about it today? Because, friends, I think we are seeing the beginning of the end of the Gaza war. And I think we're also getting a little bit of a sneak peek into how exactly it is going to end. Now, you guys know I've said for a long time how I believe the Arab-Israeli conflict will ultimately come to an end. And I mean the overarching one that has been going on really since 1929, but if you want to say since 1948, since that's when the modern day nation state of Israel was established, then go right ahead and say 1948. Nevertheless, you guys are very well aware, and for those who aren't aware, I believe that it is going to end up being the 1995 Vatican peace plan, whereby a Palestinian state is established in Judea Samaria, commonly known as the West Bank, and in Gaza. They are one state, and their capital is in East Jerusalem, a city which is partitioned three ways, with West Jerusalem being the capital of Israel, and the old city where all of the holy stuff is, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Stations of the Cross, the Dome of the Rock, the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, all that kind of stuff, right? Ends up being internationalized and probably owned by some kind of a United Nations style group only for religions, one which was proposed in 2014. That is what I believe is going to happen. It's not something I would like to happen, but it is what I believe is going to happen because it's the way that everything has been going for the last, we've been trending that direction for the last 29 years. Now, is that how this current war is going to end? I don't necessarily think so. I don't know if we're necessarily at the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict yet. But since I believe that's the direction everybody's ultimately going, I think whatever the case, this individual war will have to be ended in some way that furthers that cause, or else and maybe I'll just have to admit I'm wrong about that cause, which I don't actually think I am, to be honest with you. But of course, nobody thinks they're wrong, otherwise they'd change their opinion, right? So I think we are going to see a situation where somebody in the United States government, probably the next president, whether that be a Democratic replacement of Joe Biden or Donald Trump or what have you, will end up ending this war after the election cycle of 2024 with a new peace deal that is kind of resembling the one we currently have, which will have the backing of the UNSC and which will involve some kind of a non-committal promise to move towards Palestinian statehood, right? Thus far, the peace plan does not include anything like that, but considering we are not only seeing Hamas say they want to add some amendments, but also seeing that if this plan is accepted, it's going to have to involve the dissolution of the current Netanyahu government, which means a government that is a little bit more left-wing than the Netanyahu government will end up taking its place. Also, we see the UNSC and G7 getting involved in these sorts of things. And of course, we have the overarching Saudi, Israel, Iranian love triangle, quote unquote, kind of looming over this entire process. Because of all those things, I think it is likely we'll see a second peace plan produced, probably by whoever is the next president after the current election cycle. But maybe not. Could be Biden. Could be another nation as well, maybe China, maybe the Vatican, somebody, right? And this new peace plan will essentially include everything that Biden has already said, which was already rejected, but with the addition of some kind of a non-committal push towards Palestinian statehood, right? Now, I want to be clear, that's not what I want to happen. That's what I think is going to happen. There's a very big difference between those two things. I'm essentially putting my finger on the pulse and predicting the future here. If it was up to me, then Israel would annex Judea and Samaria and would annex Jerusalem and would annex the Gaza Strip. And we would never have to deal with this problem of Palestinian statehood again because there's no such thing as a Palestinian ethnos. But I digress. That's what I think is going to happen. And ultimately, I think this peace plan, while it is a move in that direction, will end up being rejected until such a time as we have a new president in America and the Israeli government is dissolved in Israel. thus allowing for the addition of this non-committal statement of Palestinian future statehood. And that's pretty much all we got for tonight, friends. If you liked this video, please remember to like and share the video and consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Remember to hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. Sorry, I got to move this camera here because of the way that we do things around here. I got to put it front facing. Like I said, be sure to hit that bell to get notified every time we go live. If you have any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, or anything of that nature, please set them down in the comment section below. Obviously, it's a little late to put them in the live chat now. If you'd like to follow us on various social media platforms, you can do so. I am on Gab. I am on Facebook, Twitter, Minds, MeWe, Telegram, Instagram, and Truth Social at the Tag the Synagogue. Please do also consider following the Rumble at the Tag the Synagogue so you can get these videos even when they are taken down. And if you like the content we're putting out here, friends, if you'd like to contribute to the journalism being done here, you can do so either by giving a one-time donation to the PayPal or by giving a donation of as much or as little as you like every month to the Patreon. Remember, if you join the $10 tier, you will get access to the Blogladite blog, wherein we share our thoughts on issues rather than events, as well as political philosophy and stuff of that nature. That one, of course, is monthly, and anybody who does contribute in either of those ways, I greatly appreciate you helping us to turn this into the news source that you are consistently going to. We're not going to have a special report tomorrow, namely because I was not able to get a show done on my other channel yesterday, and I want to make sure to get one done tomorrow, so we're going to focus on that. So no special report tomorrow, but Lord willing, we will be back on Thursday to discuss whatever events are taking place on Thursday. We'll see what ends up happening. Anyways, shalom, friends. Remember to be vigilant. As we say here on the Synagogue News, think like a Neanderthal and ask yourselves this question, one which becomes more and more important every day, it seems. In the face of Armageddon, will you compromise